Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. We're going to be looking at varnish today. So different types of varnish. I'm just going to bit of an overview about what you use varnish for, different types of varnish that you can use, different types of application. I'm not going super in depth with the demonstration, but I'll be talking through all the different possible options, or the main options that you're likely to use. So varnish tends to be used for oil or acrylic paintings. You don't typically varnish watercolors or gouache. You can protect them in different ways, often behind glass. But we don't usually put oils or acrylics behind glass, so we need some other way of protecting the paint surface. So if you didn't protect the paint surface with a varnish, there'd be a risk that, well, it would definitely be the case that over time, dirt or grime would build up on the surface of the painting. This was particularly true in sort of hundreds of years ago, where people had wood fires in their house. They had a lot of smoke. But even nowadays you still get a lot of dirt floating around in the air, and it would slowly build up on the surface of the painting. And there wouldn't really be any way to remove that, because you would usually need to use some sort of solvent to remove it, in which case you might redissolve the painting and ultimately destroy the paint surface. So we want some kind of barrier between the surface of the painting and the environment, essentially. Because we could then wipe the varnish, because it forms a hard film over the painting, and we're not actually kind of actively disrupting the painting surface itself. There's a barrier between. There are different types of varnish, as I say, so we're going to be looking at those different options. And also I'll do a little bit of a demonstration. One other sort of side note, this is an oil painting that I've got in front of us. So if you're varnishing an oil painting, you want to let an oil painting dry as long as possible. The minimum, I would say, is about 10 weeks. You can go shorter, but it's not ideal. Obviously, sometimes you have the constraints of, say, you had an exhibition or something has to be exhibited and it needs to be varnished for the exhibition. You don't really have a choice, you're just going to have to varnish. But if you can, try to leave paintings for quite a while before you actually varnish them. This is because the paint will have had longer to cure and dry, and it won't shift as much with the varnish on top. You have to remember the varnish is a very hard surface that you're laying over, in this case an oil painting, and the oil, if it was thick, could shift a little bit and then cause cracks quite early on. So the longer you leave it to dry, the less likely it'll develop cracks over time. So I've got a painting here which I did as a demonstration, a little landscape demo a while ago. And this painting is unvarnished. So I've given it a bit of a wipe to make sure it's reasonably dust free. But you can see it's fairly sort of matte. Now, talking about sort of the surface quality of a painting, varnish comes in different types of finish. So most traditional varnishes were gloss varnishes. This is because most traditional paintings were representational and they used quite a broad range of values. And so they had a lot of black in them, very sort of tenebristic paintings have a lot of black. And black, as we've spoken about in previous videos, sinks in quite a lot. So there is some pure black in this painting, but it looks kind of grey essentially at the moment. That's because it's sunk in and it's become more matte as it's dried. When I varnish it, it'll go darker. So it'll regain that richness. The colours will also go a bit more vibrant, and that's really good. It helps paintings a lot. So traditional paintings typically do quite well with a gloss varnish. The second option is a satin varnish, which is a slightly less glossy gloss varnish, basically. And different brands will be more or less glossy than others. You can build up gloss by doing more and more layers. So basically, the more layers of varnish you build up over time, the smoother the surface will get, the more reflective, and therefore the shinier it will look. There is also the effect of whatever particles are suspended in the vessel for the varnish. But typically, if you have a gloss varnish, if you keep adding more and more layers, it'll get shinier. And the same goes for satin. So if you had a satin varnish, if you keep adding layers of that satin varnish, it will get a bit shinier over time. So you can kind of play around with that. You could do mixtures of satin and gloss, mixtures of matte and satin, which leads us on to the final of the three primary sorts of finishes that you can get, which is a matte varnish. matte varnishes are useful when you don't want the surface to look glossy. So if you've got an much more modern abstract painting that's, say, got a lot of surface texture, if you were to cover that in a really shiny, glossy varnish, then everything would be shiny, the whole thing would look plasticky, and it wouldn't be a nice look. Well, it could be if that's what you're going for, but you have to bear in mind that if you've got a lot of surface texture and you make it glossy, then it's going to have loads of reflections. So if you don't want there to be lots of reflections, if you want, say, the form of the paint to be primary, the texture of the paint, then you opt for a matte varnish, which doesn't really alter the appearance. So it wouldn't, in this case, it wouldn't enrich in the darks of the painting. But it does protect the painting, so it still has a protective purpose, or it's still able to protect the surface without actually making it look shiny. So it's a great option if you don't want a shiny varnish, but you still obviously need to protect the piece. So yeah, that's generally the difference. You do get variations on this, and they sometimes have different names, but essentially you get gloss varnishes, satin varnishes, and matte, going from shinier to less shiny, or not shiny at all. So yeah, that pretty much covers the finish. Now, when I do my demo, we're going to be looking at the difference between a brush-on varnish, which I've got a tiny bit of left here. This is Gamvar, which is a good, quite a high-quality gloss varnish that you paint on. And then I've got a couple of Pabeo varnishes, one which is a satin finish and another which is a gloss retouch varnish. And the gloss retouch basically just means that you can rework over the top of it, but it'll demonstrate what a gloss varnish does. The satin varnish will be slightly less shiny than the gloss, hopefully. So I'm gonna basically band this painting into 3 sections and put one of each varnish. So we'll look at the difference between this gloss versus the spray-on gloss, the liquid gloss, and we'll look at the difference between the satin from that one as well. So there should be something of a step towards it being shinier. The reason you would choose a liquid varnish or a brush-on varnish over spray-on, generally I would opt for a spray varnish because it's easier to get even layers when you spray. So when you're brushing on, and it's less of an issue with a small piece like this, but if you're brushing on a really big piece, you can imagine you have to kind of go backwards and forwards over the whole length of the surface and try to make sure the whole surface is covered evenly with varnish, which sometimes takes a few coats to get right. It's beneficial if you want a very glossy look because it can be applied a bit more thickly, and typically I at least tend to find that a brush-on varnish gets a really nice glossy look. You can even pour, I've seen people pour varnishes and then kind of, which is what I'm going to do today, but you pour a lot of varnish and just kind of allow it to slide around the surface, and it's not even brushed on, it just sits on the surface, which can be quite tricky and uses a lot of varnish. It can be expensive as well. If you just want a solid way to finish off a piece, then spray is very effective. It can be very even. You basically just give it a shake, then you spray sort of side to side, slowly going down the piece. I'll be doing this in a moment. And if you're doing a really big piece, you kind of hold it a bit further back, and you just generally create this sort of mist of varnish that ends up coating the whole painting. And yeah, it makes a really even finish. It means that each layer is quite thin, so you might need to, if you're going for a very shiny look, you need to apply multiple layers, maybe kind of 5 or 6 possibly, with a gloss varnish to get a really glossy look on a black piece, which can be time consuming, but it always results in quite an even look. Sometimes also with oil paints, if you've got a lot of oil in your painting and you try to brush on, you'll find that the oil kind of, the varnish sort of sweats, it doesn't actually take, creates sort of beads of varnish, which is not ideal. Which means sometimes you might need to revert to a spray varnish to compensate for that. You can generally mix varnishes, although this brings us on to the next point, which is the difference between soft versus hard varnishes. All of these varnishes, I believe, are hard varnishes. which means they can't be removed, or typically means they can't be removed. So they used to use dissolvable crystals to make varnishes. So damar is a type of crystal. Shellac's, I think, flaked insect or something like that. But these substances that would dissolve into something like turpentine or mineral spirits, and then would be glossy when painted on, that was traditionally what they used as varnishes. And some of them would form what was called a hard surface, and some would form a soft surface. Now, a hard surface wouldn't be able to be dissolved again once it's applied to the painting. A soft surface could. Now, you may wonder why you would bother having something that can be redissolved if you don't want to remove it. Well, sometimes you do want to be able to remove the varnish, because if the varnish gets really dirty, you'd like to take it off entirely. So the disadvantage of a hard varnish is that it can't be removed easily, or if at all, but it can usually be cleaned reasonably well, so it's a good kind of general option. Using a soft varnish alone generally probably isn't recommended, I would say, or at least I wouldn't recommend it, just because it's then susceptible to being dissolved if you don't realise, or if someone cleans it with the wrong type of thing or works over it, something like that. The best method, and this was done quite a lot traditionally, was to put a hard varnish on the surface of the painting, so something that couldn't be dissolved, and then over that hard varnish put a soft varnish. So then you can take the soft varnish layer off when it gets dirty and put another soft varnish layer on, and the hard varnish protects the painting from anything happening to it. And that was traditionally, I believe, what was done to a lot of classical paintings. So finally, before I start the demonstration, you always want to look at guidelines, have a reasonable read of the guidelines of any materials that you're using. Each varnish will be slightly different, so it might tell you how long to shake the can, or how far to hold the spray away from the painting surface. It might say how toxic it is, how much ventilation you need when you're doing it, that sort of thing. Typically you will need ventilation when you're varnishing a painting. I like to varnish outside, which can be complicated because obviously outside there's dust floating around and there's wind often, so the wind can sometimes shift your varnish around a bit as you spray it if it's a spray mist, but it is safer to do that, and usually you can find somewhere that's not too windy, or wait till it's not too windy. When I let the varnish dry, usually we'll be doing this, but I usually apply the varnish so that the painting's at maybe a 45 or kind of near upright angle. But then when it's actually drying initially, I lay it flat, and that's because if you do end up with kind of a reasonably thick layer of varnish, it will still be liquid when it sits on the surface before it's dried, and it might start to kind of slowly seep down the surface of the painting and then form you get these kind of weird ripples that form. It's not good looking, and it's quite hard to get rid of because you then have to build more layers up around that. So kind of for the first maybe 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how warm it is, varnish is usually dry through evaporation. I'll leave the painting flat, which does mean it's a bit more susceptible to having dust land on it and so forth, but try to put it somewhere up high in a room, or somewhere that doesn't have too much wind activity and isn't too dusty. Lie it flat. After maybe 5 or 10 minutes, most varnishes will have started to have set sufficiently to not kind of run down the surface. Then you can prop it upright, and I usually like to prop it upright facing against a wall, and that just means there's less airflow around it, so less likely for it to get dusty. But yeah, that's roughly a general overview of how varnishes work. So I'm now going to do a little bit of a demo. I'll probably be pausing. I'm going to do each varnish and then I'll stop the camera and let it dry a bit, then do the next one, let it dry. I'm going to be masking off part of the painting, so if I zoom back a bit or tilt down, you can kind of have a look at what I'm doing. So I'm going to roughly divide it into thirds. Probably about there maybe. So we're going to start with our brush-on varnish. For this one I'm just going to leave it lying flat, as I say. This is my preferred way to apply this particular varnish, but you can always read the instructions for every varnish that you're working with to see how best to do it. So as I say, I'm just going to pour a little pool of paint, of varnish into the center, and then I'm just going to brush backwards and forwards in kind of even strokes, shift the paint till it just completely covers this edge of the piece. Then I'll stop the video for a bit, let that dry, shift my my masking tape along, and we'll do another section and just kind of end up with, I might move that, take that a little bit more forward actually, because it doesn't look too bad. Yeah, so basically we'll be masking off each section, and then once hopefully when I tilt it in the video, you'll get some idea of how shiny it's ended up looking. So this should be the glossiest, this liquid. I might just drop, no, I can't go too much lower. No, it's okay. So you should see when I pour the varnish on, the surface suddenly gets a lot richer, so I'll just pick that up, do strokes backwards and forwards, up and down, and you can see how much, particularly the darks, but some of the greens as well, have suddenly got a lot more vibrant, and that's the difference varnish makes. It's also why we talk about oiling in quite a lot when you're painting, because you can see the varnish can make blacks look maybe 2 values darker. So I didn't push too hard with my brush, I've just kind of sort of softly stroking it across the surface. You get special varnishing brushes as well that are really soft bristled. But that's pretty much it. It's a very small section of the painting that we're doing, but you can see how much shinier it's got from that. So I'm going to let that cure for a little bit, take this paper off, we'll have a look at how that compares to the original kind of pre-varnish painting. Then once that's kind of a little bit drier, we'll mask it off, do a spray with one of these 2 spray varnishes, stop again, then do another spray, so on. And then we'll end up with something in comparison, how it's going. So we'll pause that for a little bit. So I've left this to dry for about 20 minutes or so, which should be sufficient. Means I can peel back the master paper, and you'll see it's quite a substantial difference between the varnish section and the unvarnished section. So you can see how much it helps paintings to varnish them, not just protect them, but also to finish off the look of the piece. Which means we're now going to have a look at how you go about spray varnishing. So I can use the same masking tape. Might remask it so it's slightly at the edge. There we go. Block off this section that's already been done. Obviously you wouldn't need to do any of this when you're varnishing your own pieces, it's just for the sake of showing how they compare, in case you were wondering. So, set off with it. So as I say, ideally you want them to be leaning upright when you spray varnish. So we're going to use this retouch, which I think should be glossy, followed by the satin. So I'm just giving the can a shake. Should be enough. And I'm going to hold the can about kind of 15 centimeters away and just move backwards and forwards. Usually you want to start a little bit higher than the painting so that you kind of give it an even coat, and you want to kind of carry on a little bit further than the painting when you get down to the bottom. So we're going to start at one side and just kind of slowly work our way backwards and forwards. You can see I'm just kind of snaking, but all the way down to the bottom. Now you can kind of add more and more as you like, so I'm going to add a reasonable coat. That would probably be about sufficient, the amount that I've put on now, and then you allow that to dry and you just do another coat over the top. But I'm going to give it a reasonably thick coat just to see how shiny we can get relative to that painted varnish, but that's all it needs. Then I'm just going to drop it down on the ground again, and we're going to let that sit for a bit and soak in. Usually with these spray-on varnishes they look shinier than they are, and then once you actually peel them off, once you allow them to dry, they go a little bit more matte again. So we'll see how it compares once it's dried. I'm just going to lift this one off, the varnish we've already done. I don't want it to go too non-shiny. So yeah, we can leave that for a little bit. Peel this one off as well. So lastly, we're going to put a satin varnish on that final section. This time I'm just going to use a piece of wood to block off. And again, just starting above the painting and ending a little bit below it, we're just going to skim over the top. Oop. Try to keep that reasonably straight. Just a quick skim over the top, and that'll do it. And we can lie it flat. So I'm just going to let that dry for a bit, because at the moment, as it's still wet, it doesn't look too much less shiny than the gloss central panel. To be honest, they all look quite similar, but after a little bit of drying there should be a bit more of a difference between the two, between the three. So finally we can just have a quick look at how the three sections compare. So it's quite subtle, but it's hard to catch it on camera. But you can maybe see there's just a little bit more gloss to the central section. Not quite so glossy, but maybe a little bit more even, the brushed section. But I did really load that middle section with a lot of gloss varnish when I sprayed it. So that's come out the shiniest. But it's something you can experiment with, and you'll certainly be aware of how much kind of crisper and more contrasty that painting now looks after being varnished. But yeah, that pretty much covers it. There's an accompanying document for you to read through on the blog or on the OCAD studio. As always, subscribe to these videos if you want to get more tips and advice. And if you sign up to the OCAD school, you can get one-to-one advice on anything you've done. But yeah, have a look through the other tutorials and see if you find anything that interests you. Thanks a lot for watching. See you guys soon.